There are places where the past never truly dies, where every stone, every shadow, every whisper of wind carries the weight of stories left unfinished. Franklin Castle is one such place, a mansion built on ambition, loss, and secrets that refuse to rest. For more than a century, this house has stood watch over Cleveland. Its walls have seen the rise and fall of fortunes, the laughter of children, and the silent, suffocating grief of tragedy. Some say the very air here is different, heavy, charged, as if the house itself is holding its breath. It's easy to dismiss these stories in the daylight, to laugh at the idea of ghosts and curses. But as night falls and the shadows deepen, doubt creeps in. The castle's history is written in sorrow and mystery, and not all of it is buried in the past. Based on real reports, based on real fear. Story 1. The Girl in White. Emily had always considered herself a skeptic, the kind of person who watched ghost shows with a smirk and rolled her eyes at tales of haunted houses. But something about Franklin Castle called to her, a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. When she signed up for the evening tour, she told herself it was just for fun. Yet as she approached the looming mansion, its windows dark and watchful, she felt a flicker of doubt. Inside, the air was thick with dust and history. The group's footsteps echoed on the creaking floorboards, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb something ancient. Emily found herself drifting to the back of the group, her gaze lingering on the faded wallpaper, the ornate woodwork, the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. Every so often she caught a chill, as if the house itself was exhaling. The guide led them up the grand staircase, each step groaning under their weight. On the third floor, the group paused while the guide recounted the story of Emma Tiedemann, the young daughter of the original owner, whose life was cut tragically short. Emily felt a sudden urge to move away from the others, drawn down a narrow hallway lined with warped mirrors and peeling paint. It was there in the hush that she first heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing, so faint she wondered if it was just the wind. But as she strained to listen, the sound grew clearer, unmistakably human. Emily's skin prickled. She glanced over her shoulder. The group was far behind, their voices distant. The sobbing continued, rising and falling, a sound so full of sorrow it made Emily's heart ache. She turned toward the nearest mirror, and for a heartbeat, she saw not her own reflection, but that of a little girl in a white dress, her face pale and streaked with tears. The girl's eyes met hers, wide, pleading, filled with a grief that seemed to stretch across the decades. Emily's breath caught. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. The girl raised a trembling hand as if reaching for help, and in that instant, Emily felt a wave of sadness so deep it threatened to pull her under. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the girl was gone. The sobbing faded, replaced by the distant creak of floorboards and the murmured voices of the tour group. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding, a cold sweat on her brow. She rejoined the others, but the image of the girl in white lingered in her mind, haunting her long after she left the castle. For weeks afterward, Emily would wake in the night, certain she heard the faint sound of weeping, and wonder if the girl was still reaching out from the shadows, desperate to be seen. Story 2. The Woman in Black. Mark prided himself on his rational mind. As a historian, he'd spent years debunking ghost stories, tracing legends back to mundane origins. When he was granted permission to spend a night alone in Franklin Castle, he saw it as the perfect opportunity to prove, once and for all, that the tales were nothing more than overactive imaginations and creaking old pipes. He arrived on a stormy evening, the sky bruised and heavy. Rain lashed the windows as he set up his workspace in the upstairs study, surrounded by stacks of old documents and the soft glow of a single lamp. The house felt alive, every gust of wind making the walls shudder, every thunderclap echoing through the empty rooms. Midnight came and went, and Mark found himself growing uneasy. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the relentless tick of an ancient clock and the occasional groan of settling wood. He tried to focus on his notes, but his mind wandered, drawn to the stories he'd dismissed as fantasy. He thought of the Tiedemann family, of the tragedies that had unfolded within these walls, and for the first time he felt a pang of doubt. Then, without warning, The temperature plummeted. The lamp flickered, casting wild shadows across the room. Mark looked up, his breath fogging in the air. In the doorway stood a woman, tall, regal, dressed in morning black. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow with grief. She didn't move, didn't speak. The air grew thick with the scent of old perfume, tinged with something sour and decayed. Mark's mouth went dry. He tried to stand, but his legs felt leaden, as if the very air was pushing him down. The woman's gaze was unblinking, her sorrow radiating from her like a physical force. Mark's heart pounded, and for a moment, he was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so intense it brought tears to his eyes. A grief that wasn't his own, a longing that seemed to stretch into eternity. The woman turned, her movements slow and deliberate, and began to glide down the hallway. Mark forced himself to follow, his footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. But when he reached the corridor, it was empty. The cold lingered, and the scent of perfume hung in the air, mingling with the musty odor of old secrets. Mark spent the rest of the night huddled in the study, afraid to move, afraid to look up and see those hollow eyes staring back at him. He left at dawn, forever changed, and never again dismissed the stories of Franklin Castle. Story 3: The Radio Host's Encounter. John Webster was known for his bravado. As a radio host, he'd made a career out of mocking the supernatural, challenging listeners to send him their scariest stories and laughing them off on air. When he was invited to record a Halloween special at Franklin Castle, he jumped at the chance, eager to prove that even the most haunted house in Cleveland was no match for his skepticism. He arrived after dark, the castle looming above him, its windows like empty eyes. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional groan of the old building settling. John set up his tape recorder on the grand staircase, his voice echoing as he narrated the castle's history for his audience. As he spoke, he felt a sudden chill, as if the air itself had turned against him. The hairs on his arms stood up, and he shivered, but pressed on, determined not to let his nerves get the better of him. He paused, listening, and heard nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the relentless silence. Then from behind him came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, descending the stairs. John spun around, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. He forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease, and resumed recording. But the feeling of being watched only intensified. The air felt charged, electric, as if a storm was brewing inside the very walls. Without warning, an invisible force slammed into him, knocking the recorder from his hands. It tumbled down the steps, shattering the silence with each bounce. John's heart raced. He scrambled to retrieve the device, his hands trembling. When he played back the tape, his blood ran cold. Beneath his own voice, a guttural whisper hissed, "Get out." The words were unmistakable, angry, urgent, not quite human. John left Franklin Castle that night, his bravado shattered. He never returned, and he never again mocked the stories that haunted those ancient halls. For the rest of his career, whenever listeners asked about the supernatural, he would simply say, "Some places don't want to be disturbed," and leave it at that. Franklin Castle's stories linger in the shadows, waiting for the next soul willing to listen. If you've felt the chill tonight, share your own haunted tale below. And remember, some doors once opened can never be closed. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, don't let the haunting end here. Tell us, have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Do you believe some places are truly haunted? Share your story in the comments. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more haunted tales. And let us know which haunted location you want to explore next.